I'm Mark Scribner from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I focus on transportation and infrastructure issues there. We're here to talk about sort of solving a major problem our country's facing, and that is how to pay for these massive infrastructure reconstruction projects, both on the surface side, so roads, but also subsurface, water and wastewater. So over the next 2 decades, we're going to be facing these giant reconstruction costs, and they're estimated to be in the multiple trillions of dollars. Now you have other industries such as the railroads, electricity, pipelines, who face similar challenges, but they're managing to sort of deal with them a little bit better than we are on the roads and water and wastewater side, and that's largely because they're private, or far more private. With water and wastewater and with roads, we're dealing with government monopolies, and we all know how things sometimes go in that arena. So this is an issue. I don't think it's really a left-right issue. It's really a matter of good government and sort of common sense, and that we do have these procurement policies on the books that are driving up costs fairly dramatically, and we can save, over the next 20 years, hundreds of billions of dollars if we simply open up procurement and allow for competitive bidding that we're doing in several other areas. It's just, it's now time to extend this to water and wastewater and to highways. So I'm going to go right over to our panel now. We've got, Justin has arrived. Delegate Reedy, thank you, thank you for being here.
Nice to see you.
So first we're going to go with Dr. Bonner Cohen. Bonner is an adjunct scholar at CEI, and he's also a senior fellow with the National Center for Public Policy Research here in D.C. And over at NCPPR, he specializes in environmental, energy, and regulatory affairs. He also serves as a senior policy analyst with the Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. Articles by Dr. Cohen have appeared in dozens of newspapers and periodicals around the country, and he's been interviewed on numerous international, national, and regional television and radio outlets. Dr. Cohen is author of The Green Wave, Environmentalism and Its Consequences, published by the Capital Research Center in 2006. Dr. Cohen received his BA from the University of Georgia and his PhD, summa cum laude, from the University of Munich. Bonner?
Well, thank you very much, Mark. You know, when we think of infrastructure, the first picture that comes to our mind is that of deteriorating roads, bridges, tunnels, and the like. But what we frequently forget is that perhaps the most serious of all of our infrastructure problems is located not above ground, but below. Namely, in the vast network of our vast underground water network that brings us our drinking water and provides a way to deal with our wastewater. The problem here may be out of sight, but it should not be out of mind. It should not be out of mind for the very simple reason that it is a disastrous problem. We can see the manifestation of that in one absolutely appalling figure. Every year, there are approximately 300,000 water main breaks throughout North America. Now, we can see these things quite spectacularly. If you want to go on the web, look up the largest 2 or 3 cities in your state, and simply say, if you are from Phoenix, Google Phoenix water main break. If you are from Pennsylvania, Google Philadelphia and Pittsburgh water main break. And horrendous videos from the local television stations will come up, and you will see an enormous amount of water spewing into the air and going to waste. How big is that waste nationwide? It is enormous. Roughly 17% of all the water that is pumped in the United States goes to waste as a result of leaking pipes and pipes that are subjected to these horrific water main breaks. How much is it going to cost to take care of this? Well, according to the United States Conference of Mayors in a 2010 report, $3.8 trillion, that's trillion with a T, between 2009 and 2028. This is an amount of money that we all know is absolutely staggering. And if you think of the conditions in which both the federal and many state and local governments find themselves strapped for cash, having to cope with the recent recession and the sluggish recovery, the question arises, how can we possibly deal with this? Because when we're talking about underground water infrastructure, we are talking about the water we drink, the water we bathe in, the water that we use to dispose of our wastewater. So this is something that has very deep public health implications. Indeed, viruses can make their way into the water systems through the leaks in our piping systems, our underground water networks. So this is a very serious issue. It is one we cannot afford to ignore, but it is also one, when we look at the traditional sources of funding for this, we can see that we can't get there from here. Let me give you an example. The most well-known federal program for dealing with this is something called the state revolving funds. Many of you will be, who are congressional staffers and otherwise, you will be familiar with this program. The state revolving funds, or the program is run through a U.S. EPA, and it provides funds which states and localities match in their own way. Last year, in fiscal year 2012, the one we're in now, the state revolving funds amounted to $7.7 billion. That sounds like an impressive figure until you consider a figure I gave you earlier, that over the next 20 years we're going to have to spend $3.8 trillion to deal with the problem. And of that $3.8 trillion, according to US EPA, 60% of that amount will have to go to repairing and restoring our underground water pipes. That is, as we all can tell, an enormous amount of money. So the question arises, in a time when we're having a slow economic recovery, in a time when the federal government, the state governments, and local governments are cash-strapped in ways that none of us could imagine 10 or 15 years ago. How can we go about this? What we do know is that traditional ways of doing things will never allow us to address the problem. What we want to propose at this luncheon is opening up many outdated procurement systems at all levels of government and allowing the creative talents of the American people through the products and technologies that they develop to enter into the competitive bidding process. Sadly, many municipalities around the country have procurement procedures that are as antiquated as many of their pipes, some of which, including, by the way, those serving Washington, D.C., where we are over 100 years old. The problem with the piping system, however, is not so much the age as it is corrosion. Corrosion is an absolutely unavoidable result of over time that will happen to metallic pipes. It cannot be avoided, and these corroded pipes must be replaced. By opening up competitive bidding procedures at the federal, state, and local level, we can allow the products and technologies that sadly in many municipalities are effectively excluded from the bidding process to enter the ring and to compete. What we don't want is to have bidding procedures that effectively exclude technologies. This is something that feeds the endemic culture of crony capitalism, which is alive and well, sadly, in Washington, D.C., but is also alive and well at many municipalities across the country. We will never, and I repeat, never be able to address this problem seriously until we change the way we do business. Fortunately, some cities around the country are already doing this. The city of Baltimore, Maryland, 40 miles up the road here, in 1950 had a population of 949,000. According to the 2012 estimate of the Census Bureau, that is now down to 621,000. What that tells you is, of course, that Baltimore is trying to provide the services of police, fire department, schools, what have you, with an ever-decreasing revenue base. And one of the services Baltimore is supposed to provide is that of supplying water and wastewater systems to its residents. It clearly is limited in its ability to raise taxes, because this would perhaps, and raise the rates for the water, because this may force even more residents to leave the city and go out into suburbia. This kind of problem is faced by many cities across the country. Baltimore recently, and to its everlasting credit, has finally decided to abandon its procurement procedures that effectively excluded products and technologies for decades, and is now allowing competitive bidding to deal with its problem, allowing producers of products and technologies to enter the bidding process and to enter the bidding process with the goal of, which is what we favor here, let the best technology win. Baltimore is not alone in doing this. Other cities as diverse as Fargo, Dallas, Cleveland, Houston, many other cities are doing much the same thing. Other cities, unfortunately, are not. They are including my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, but also cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, Philadelphia, Detroit, are all mired in the old ways of doing things. And as long as they continue doing the old ways of doing things, they will never be able to address a problem that affects every resident of those cities. At the federal level, you may ask, well, what can we do? Well, I think we can begin by setting an example that the old ways of doing things are, the days of the old ways of doing things have come and gone. Now, when we think of the United States Department of Agriculture, we don't necessarily think, well, this is the center or a bastion of innovation and creativity, right? Well, wrong. Ever since 2002, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's one of its programs called the Rural Utilities Service has been providing financial assistance to rural water systems. And it has done so in a very unique way. Ever since 2002, it has mandated that recipients of its fund allow the decisions to be made on who gets the contracts to supply these products and technologies, that those procedures be open to competitors. What would be something that we would love to see across the board at the federal, state, and local level is for precisely the RUS program, the Rural Utility Service, to be duplicated by other federal agencies, to be duplicated by state agencies, and ultimately to be duplicated by as many municipal governments as possible. The results in savings can be absolutely enormous. Remember, I said $3.8 trillion is the size that the U.S. Conference of Mayors estimates with the amount of money we're going to have to spend between now and 2028. Again, 60% of that, or something in the neighborhood of $2.2 to $2.3 trillion, is going to have to go to repair our leaking and rusting and breaking underground water infrastructure. One way we can address that is to provide for competitive bidding at all levels of government, allowing the best technology to come to the fore to deal with the problem, thereby saving taxpayers and ratepayers incredible amounts of money, and thereby dealing with a public health problem that we cannot afford to ignore. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bonner. Our next speaker is Gary Hoitzma. Gary is managing associate at the Carmen Group, which is a DC-based government affairs firm where he's worked on transportation-related clients over the past 10 years and now serves as editor of the firm's weekly online publication. And there should be copies out there, sample copies out there for you to read. It's very good. I highly recommend it. And that's called the Washington Letter on Transportation. Gary previously served as press secretary to Senator James Inhofe, and during the Reagan administration, he was special assistant to the administrator and director of public and congressional affairs at the Federal Highway Administration. Gary?
Thank you very much. Following up on what Cohen had to say, I would like to focus on a case study dealing with the issue of competition and competitive bidding in the federal aid highway program, just to give you an idea of some of the back and forth that has gone on in history on this topic as it deals with the selection of culvert pipe used in highway projects. And I start with a disclaimer that I have represented one of the largest manufacturers of HDPE plastic pipe in the country, ADS, and they have a vested interest in this issue that I've been working on, so I have some knowledge of it from that perspective. You should be aware that there's an alternative side to the side that I'm going to say. The concrete pipe industry looks at this issue a little differently. I encourage you to get their side of it and make your own decision. But let me start with the MAP 21 highway bill. You remember that from last year, passed the MAP 21 surface transportation bill. Somebody once said you have to pass the bill in order to see what's in it. Well, here's an example of that. 800-page bill, you go down to section 1525, a one-sentence provision. It reads that state autonomy for culvert pipe selection. It directs the Secretary of Transportation must modify federal highway regulations to ensure that states shall have the autonomy to determine culvert and storm sewer material types to be included in the construction of a federal aid highway project. Now, is that good or bad? If you're a conservative Republican like me and you hear that, your inclination is to say state autonomy, this is good, this is what we should be doing, turning more programs back to the states. But you must understand that this provision, which you cannot determine from reading it, you must understand that what this provision does is it undermines the federal competition and competitive bidding requirements as they apply to pipe. And this makes no good sense whatsoever. Let me just give you a little history, and so you get the backstory of what's going on here. The Federal Highway Program was established in 1956, and in order to select products and materials, there was regulations put in that the default position of the federal government would be competition and competitive bidding. That's the best way to create efficiencies and to encourage innovations and so forth. That's 1956. That applied throughout. Then 1974, along comes a new provision that carves out a special carve-out just for pipe and says, here are the ways pipe should be used, and it basically says that on most projects, concrete pipe should be used, and on some limited other projects, other types of pipe could be used. But at that time in 1974, there were only two types of pipe used for drainage on highways, concrete and steel. Now, fast forward 30 years to 2005. There are five types of pipe: concrete, steel, aluminum, PVC, and HDPE, the last two being two different types of plastic pipe, if you will. And so my client was instrumental in getting into the highway bill at that time in safety lieu a provision which said we shouldn't be dictating which pipes go where. We should be deferring to competition in this area. So basically the provision said in the selection of culvert pipe, there should be competition, just like there is for every other highway product, light posts, guardrails, pavement markings, safety equipment, all of these things. They all go through competition. That's the default position of the federal government. Now, fast forward 7 years to 2012. The concrete industry did not like that provision from 2005. And why would that be? Well, concrete dominates the pipe market. They control about 80%. All the rest control about 20%. So they were in danger of losing market share to the extent that competition was extended and expanded from what it was. And so they countered with a counter provision, which basically is the provision that I read to you that says it should be deferred, these decisions should be deferred to the states. Now, that's fine. Most states provide for competition on their own, but there are a number of states that do not, that resist that very, very much. And so what you have in those particular states is monopolies accruing that lead to higher costs and less competition and less innovation. And so that is a little bit of the history here that has gone on. The need here is to understand that competition is going to help the federal government lower costs and construct more projects by enabling these states to have more money to do these projects. And so I come back to the state of Utah said that it would, the cost of using only concrete pipe would limit their ability to fund other projects. And this is exactly what's happening in a number of these states. And so what Adam Smith said many years ago is true. Competition reduces costs and improves quality. And that is a sense of wisdom that we should apply to the infrastructure programs of the country.
All right, thank you, Gary. And our final speaker before we go into Q&A is Delegate Justin Reedy, who represents District 5A in the Maryland House of Delegates. Delegate Reedy serves on the Health and Government Operations Committee and two standing subcommittees, Minority Health Disparities and Government Operations, which deals with state procurement and contracting, as well as the state's minority and women-owned business enterprise program. Delegate Reedy is the fourth youngest legislator in the Maryland General Assembly. He grew up in Carroll County, Maryland, after moving from Mississippi with his parents at age 11. Justin is a graduate of Salisbury University on Maryland's Eastern Shore, where he majored in political science and history. Delegate Reedy is self-employed. He's a business owner, and he's worked as State Senate and House of Delegates staff, and also served as executive director of the Maryland Republican Party. Justin and his wife, Ruth, who's an elementary school music teacher, and their one-year-old daughter, Brooklyn, reside in Westminster, Maryland. Delegate Reedy?
Thank you very much. And I just voted this morning in a nonpartisan municipal election where one of the big issues our local town government is faced is rising water rates. This issue, because of wastewater treatment issues. So this issue is not something that is only for the federal government. It's something that affects state and local, down to the very localist of local governments as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I know the topic is competitive bidding. I wanted to talk a little bit about competitive bidding and procurement policies in an era of austerity and sort of how that affects us at the state level. It's easy to believe as we look at some of the large deficits we hear about at the federal government and state governments dealing with issues related to their budgets. It's easy to think that the focusing on government procurement and focusing on the bidding process is sort of playing around the edges of a much larger problem. But I believe at the state level, actually, we've seen that it actually can be sort of a pathway to really looking at savings and better value for taxpayers, generally looking at our procurement and bidding processes. Maryland has an operating budget and a capital budget. Our $20 billion capital budget roughly is, there are billions of dollars that are spent through the procurement process, and that as we look at road construction, school construction, et cetera. But actually, even in the operating budget, about 7.5% to 8% of our operating budget, over $1 billion, is spent through procurement and contracts. So as we analyze how the state can get the best value for its money and get and hopefully save taxpayer dollars, it does have a profound impact. Sometimes you can think about procurement, at least when I first got elected, I did not think I would be spending a lot of time focusing on procurement. When you're running for office, you think a lot more about grander issues, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And I'm a Republican in a very blue state, so I also thought about how I can work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to get things done. And one of the areas that we have found some common ground has been, I have with several of my progressive liberal friends in the House, has been looking at making sure our state government's procurement processes are streamlined, are transparent, and also are saving taxpayer dollars. We have made some progress in Maryland opening up and streamlining our procurement process, but really more work has been done, I would say, in the area of human services, education, and health care. But there's a constant struggle, I think, that lawmakers face in all the states, but certainly in my state I've seen it, a constant struggle to modernize government agencies and bring them into the 21st century as it relates to technology in their operational processes. And also flexibility in procurement and allowing for changes and allowing for new technologies. It's always a very big battle to get a state agency to look at things differently, because oftentimes it requires some changes in the law. And once we get to trying to make changes in the law, the devil is very much in the very minutest detail. I'm going to give you a couple examples of some work we've done in Maryland that have nothing to do with lead with pipes, and I hope that's okay, because I have specific knowledge. I've spent a good bit of time on my committee working in the area of procurement. One example, some legislation I worked on in the past session that we had, dealt with trying to allow human service providers like juvenile centers, foster care homes, to submit submit the booklets and booklets of information that they have to print and ship to the state every year, thousands and thousands of pages, trying to allow them to submit those and put those into an online database to save both printing for the provider and storage and also for the state. But just trying to allow for certain things to be put online into a secure online database. The state didn't even have to pay for it. There are databases that could be used through the private sector. Figuring out how that would be procured, figuring out how the state agencies would now interact with each other and with the providers. Literally I spent probably 60 or 70 days of the 90-day session in detailed back and forth with these different state agencies, simply to make what I felt was, and some of my colleagues felt was a very minor change to just modernize our processes. So imagine the trouble you have at a state level when you come to talking about changing what kind of pipe we're going to put under our roads or other items like that. Obviously, then they're talking about bigger amounts of money and even more struggle. We also had a situation where our state does a purchasing contract with a major national corporation that gives all of our state agencies a catalog whereby they can buy things out of when they need them. But what was happening is, while on some level there were some savings in uniformity and in ease of procurement, we also faced the challenge where when perhaps like a jail, which I don't know if you've seen, some of Maryland's jails have been in the news lately, the jails that are always underfunded are trying to make major changes in like their plumbing or their kitchen supplies, and buying through this company, they could go out to a local Maryland business and save 20, 30, 40%. But there's very limited flexibility in what they're allowed to buy outside of this procurement catalog. Now, that is not the same, obviously, as what we're discussing with lead pipes, but it does, again, illustrate, I think, the challenge we face at all levels. Government at all levels has been slow to adjust to our new technologies and to really the new economy that we face now in the 21st century as we're into the second decade. Baltimore was one of the cities that was mentioned in the Competitive Enterprise Institute report that was not flexible, and now they are changing. But it's not really a red state or blue state problem. It seems to go across party lines where there are many cities that you would think would be more conservative and more liberal, and it's a hodgepodge of who is really looking out to say, hey, we could save a lot of money for our taxpayers and be much more we can get much better value for our money if we looked at different technologies. But in order to do that, you have to make a lot of changes in your code. And a lot of times, That's, as I've tried to demonstrate, is sort of the devil's in the details when you really sit down and look at drafting a piece of legislation, if you're in a state legislature or in a county council or wherever, to try to change things. You end up having a lot of difficulty because state agencies, by and large, and county agencies, just like the federal government, change is not something that is often embraced. Everybody likes the idea of change, but when you actually have to sit down and say, okay, how is this going to affect our day-to-day processes, becomes very, you hit a lot of obstacles, and that is true no matter who the president is or who the governor is. It seems to be true in every situation. So I look at how we can tackle our overall financial problems in the country and in my state, and I don't believe that procurement changes and modernization will hold all the answers to the fiscal issues we're facing or to the transportation needs and infrastructure needs we have. The infrastructure improvements would still be expensive whether you bid them competitively or not. But I think truly competitive bidding is an excellent start. And on the fiscal side, a willingness to drill way down into the minutia of government and what we're spending on contracts and on procurement. I think it would go further than people think in addressing some of our deficit issues and addressing certainly at local governments and state governments, our financial issues that we've had. So I look forward to answering your questions, and I do appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thank you, Delegate Reedy. Now is time for Q&A. So we've got a roving mic. Raise your hand. I guess keep it simple. Go right there.
Good afternoon. I guess I'm confused about a very basic part of this argument. Competitive bidding, the federal government, and as Gary said, most states already do competitive bidding, so I'm not sure what the advocacy is for, except unless you're talking about that small minority of states.
I'm talking about the small minority of states, and I'm talking about the enforcement of the federal regulations as they are. There are federal regulations that require competitive bidding. They are not enforced that well. In fact, there was a report from the Department of Transportation Inspector General, which I have a handout there that quotes specifically from their examination of the Federal Highway Administration's approach to the stimulus bill and how it put the money out there. And basically, among their conclusions was that FHWA could do a much better job of enforcing its existing competitive bidding requirements in order to save money.
And Bonner, do you want to talk?
Yes, I can add something to that, because at the local level, at municipalities across the country, we do have sadly, many instances where competitive bidding is simply not the order of the day. Ideally, a competitive bidding process with respect to underground water pipes, and let's be blunt about it, there are two big competitors here. There's ductile iron type and polyvinyl chloride or PVC pipe. The competitive bidding process should be open to both of those on an equal level, as well as anyone else who wants to enter the fray. But in municipality after municipality, and I mentioned some earlier, just to reiterate, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, tons of others, you can see they're scattered around the country. We don't have that. And if you look at the magnitude of the problems, all of those cities, as well as similar cities who do not have competitive bidding procedures, if they continue to do things the way they have been accustomed to doing them, and we should thank Delegate Reedy to point out just how difficult it is to get people to change the way they're doing things. You know, human beings are creatures of habit, as are the agencies and departments we create. Getting these people to wake up to certain technical realities of the 21st century is easier said than done. But unless and until municipalities recognize that things have changed, particularly in the technical era, and that they can address the serious problems of a decaying underground water system by simply opening up the procurement procedures, these cities which have failed to do so are simply going to see the decay go from bad to worse.
And I think where CEI comes at it, I mean, basically, I mean, we're generally, as an organization, skeptical of government regulation, particularly at the federal level. But in this case, basically, as long as the federal government is going to be doling out all this money to states and local communities, there might as well be some standards in there to make sure that the taxpayers' dollars are spent wisely. So I hope that helps. Questions?
Mae Von Garrity with Congressman Alan Lowenthal's office. I think you just touched on something that I wasn't hearing enough of, I think. That I think the federal government has an interest in ensuring that their infrastructure dollars are spent on quality infrastructure that's going to take us decades out. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, not just the competitive process to see how much money we can save and put the savings toward other projects, but how are we looking at life cycle costs and ensuring that we do have the quality investment?
I could answer the question just from the perspective of life cycle. One of the things that, again, coming from my perspective as more of a conservative Republican state legislator would have been always, first thought is, how much money can we save the taxpayers? But one of the number one things I think in all the money that is spent in government in general, and there is a lot of money, we do need to analyze, are we getting quality? And is it something that that we can, as you said, add years out? A lot of times, though, newer technologies, a little scary to try newer technologies, but we know that things like PVC pipe, for example, sometimes in certain settings can be a much better option because it's not only will it last perhaps longer than sort of some of the old standards, but also easier to repair. And so I do think that's a major factor to be considered.
Yeah, I would just say the federal regulations account for that. They are flexible in a lot of these respects, in that in dealing with the pipe issue, specifically in drainage pipe, the federal competition requirements allow a state to forgo competitive bidding if there is a public interest that is certified by the Federal Highway Administration, that if there is no suitable alternative exists based on engineering judgment, that is acceptable. So there are those things. The other point to make is that competitive bidding is not just a matter of choosing the lowest price that comes out of competitive bidding. It's a matter of making all of the competitors sharpen their pencils, so to speak, to get a lower cost. If you have an environment where there is no competitive bidding, the prices are naturally going to go up. If you do have competitive bidding, the prices are naturally going to come down, no matter which one you pick. If you might pick one that's not maybe the lowest, but it's still going to get a better price.
Go ahead.
Yes, sure. There are standards, there are AASHTO standards, the state highway officials do that, and there's minimum requirements that you have to meet.
And you were saying, Bob?
Yeah, the questioner raised the issue of accountability. That is, how are the federal dollars going to be spent at the state and local level? She also raised the question of transparency. How are decisions going to be made with respect to which products and technologies are going to be asked? There's probably which products and technologies are going to be considered for the bidding. So there is probably no better way to guarantee accountability and no better way to guarantee transparency than to have a truly open competitive bidding process, one that is devoid of backroom deals, one is devoid of long-standing sweetheart relationships between suppliers and local governments. It's a sad reality of our country, but unfortunately those things, the latter, the sweetheart deals, do determine the procurement decisions and have done so for a long, long time in many municipalities. And that is precisely the kind of thing we need to move away from, because particularly with respect to the problems we are looking at with water pipes, the situation is so serious that however cozy the relationships might have been between supplier and a certain state procurement agency, that we simply no longer can allow that to happen, because further decay will take place. And as I said, when you're talking about water, you're talking about something that is intimately related with public health.
Questions?
I don't know if any of you can address this, but either you individually or your organizations, if you have any thoughts on the Buy American provisions that are being added to a lot of the legislation. I know in one of the water pieces of legislation this week where they're expecting to add that there will be added a Buy American provision, and in how that affects procurement and competitiveness.
I can tell you at our state level, we just dealt with this issue in the last session. We had a Buy American bill come through to my committee, and the problem with the Buy American is I think setting aside and saying we're going to allow for a certain amount of the price being slightly higher because we're buying American is probably okay. One of the problems with how some provisions are written, and I admit I'm not familiar with the federal side as much, but is if every piece of that particular product, whatever it may be, must be from an American location or American business, you sometimes have, as in our case at the state, we had some issues with fire sprinklers that are installed in government offices and also in homes. There's one piece of a major fire sprinkler that is only manufactured basically in, I think, Germany. So you do have to be careful that, and then also the bill that originally came into my committee had, it was like it could have up to 20% more cost, which I think that's a little extreme. We don't want to be 20% more. So I think you have to, again, that's where like I said, the devil's in the details, because it sounds great. And I generally am someone who is somewhat more protectionist, and then I don't mind seeing us spend a tiny bit more for an American-made product. But we do need to be careful you don't, in the rush to do that, have a lot of unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, and I can just say from CEI's perspective, we're strongly opposed to all Buy America provisions. We strongly support free trade generally. Actually this does come into play because, we often talk about sort of the domestic market with pipe materials, and you're saying, well, ductile iron is obviously the dominant player here, but you have other guys like PVC coming in. The domestic ductile iron industry is active at keeping out foreign ductile iron, and then, the whole situation globally is it's very similar to what we see here in the United States. There are a lot of carve-outs to a very small number of companies, and we're seeing that play out. And it isn't just the pipes. You're talking about fire hydrants and all sorts of infrastructure that it sounds great when you say we're helping an American company, but you're often going to be spending quite a bit more, and you may be shutting out certain new technologies and higher quality that you could otherwise sort of access. So that's sort of the CEI position on that.
Yeah, I would add to that anytime you hear Buy America, I think buyer beware, because frequently Buy America arguments are nothing but a smokescreen to limit competition and to perpetuate long-standing cozy relationships between the supplier and the federal, state, or local agency, particularly the latter two. So yes, at first glance it sounds fine. But there is a potentially very dark side to that, and it's something that everyone should be aware of.
Any more questions? Well, seeing none, I think we're going to wrap this up. Thank you all for being here, and I think could we get one more round of applause for our panel? I think they did a great job.